Hey, everybody, welcome back to the show. Here we are on episode 132. I'm going to call this one, What are Burls? This is part 2 in our ongoing series about figured woods. And if you haven't figured it out already, we're going to talk about burls. What are they? What kind of figure is it? How do we deal with them? Or where do we find them? As always, I am your host, Shannon Rogers, your resident wood nerd. I'm here to talk about, well, burls and a bunch of stuff that's going on in the lumber industry. As always, thank you for tuning in, whether you're watching the video on YouTube or you're listening in your favorite podcatcher. I'm happy to be answering some of your questions. And, I say this every single week, but I should say it again. Please keep sending your questions. If you go to lumberupdate.com, you can fill out a form there. You can just email me at lumberupdate@gmail.com. You can find me on Instagram at lumberupdateshow, and you can submit direct messages there. I've gotten a lot of questions over the last couple of weeks. Gotten some great feedback, a couple of industry stories. So thank you guys for preparing the show so easy. And thank you as well to all those folks who taken the extra step to sponsor the show. They went to patreon.com/lumberupdate and became sponsors of the show. And, each month my walnut tier sponsors get fancy species stickers, and you'll be getting one this month as well. But enough of the business stuff. Let's get into some, lumber industry news. Actually, let's start with some feedback because it's relevant to one of the featured species we recently had, cottonwood. And I was talking about how cottonwood has some ugly reputations, but then how other people have found very unique uses for it. And I heard from both Kyle and Jim on YouTube in the comment section, which is actually another place you can ask questions or, submit comments. Both of them rave about cottonwood for carving, but not just cottonwood, specifically the bark of cottonwood. And I got to admit, I'd never heard of this before. And I looked into it a little bit more. And again, thank you to both Kyle and Jim for the additional information. I did some own research on this, dug into it, called one of my customers who supplies carving blocks. If you've ever done like figurine carving or like Santa carving or something, a lot of times you can buy like a small box of blocks of basswood that's already in basic shapes for most of the figurine carving. This is a guy who's been selling this stuff for decades to wood carvers. And one of the other products that he sells is cottonwood. So I talked to him a little bit more, and the bark grows additively in layers, just like you would expect, layers of growth rings on a tree. And it's kind of like cork, but quite a bit harder. It's very homogeneous in its texture, and it carves very much like basswood. Now, not as hard as basswood. It's particularly interesting because it can be harvested in ways without killing the tree, which was also news to me because there's always been my perception that when you take the bark off a tree and you're taking off that protective armor and you can actually kill the tree. Well, because it grows additively like that, they can actually carve off parts of the bark while still leaving a section close to the tree to protect it, and it will continue to add on to it. In many instances, you can find this bark like 4, 5, 6 inches thick, and you can actually get full-on carving blanks from it. I've actually reached out to this customer of mine and said, hey, hook me up. And I bought a couple of blocks of the stuff. Hopefully should be arriving any day. And I'm actually looking forward to diving into that. So thank you to Kyle and Jim for pointing me to something I did not know about cottonwood. I wish I'd known it when I did the episode, but that's why you guys are here, to give me, new information about stuff that's no possible way that I can know everything about every single species. So I love that kind of hands-on knowledge. So again, cool stuff. I was glad to see that. Industry news here. I want to say it's probably 8 or 9 episodes ago, I talked about how Allegheny Wood Products very unexpectedly closed almost overnight, and a lot of jobs were lost. And this was really sad to see because this is was a big company. Well, the aftermath of that, is still being felt by lots of West Virginia. Well, the family that is who were the owners of Allegheny Wood Products, has decided to sell their private land holdings. They have 2,700 acres in West Virginia, and they are going to give it or sell it to the state, and it's going to be put into protected state lands. So From a lumber industry perspective, I have an opinion on this that it kind of bothers me that this is going to the government to be protected lands. From the guy who loves to ride his bike out in the forest and loves to go camping and hiking, I think that's fantastic. More protected recreation lands is good. But from the host of this show, who recently talked about healthy forests, I have to wonder, how does the state of West Virginia plan to manage these protected lands? So, the article and the news that I've read so far about this, and I don't know if it's a sale or a donation, honestly. I think it is a sale as I look through this article. I feel like there was purchase price is expected to be about $14 million for this. This was land that was managed by the family and harvested. It wasn't just like, oh, this is our fun backyard land. No, this was something that they bought and they managed and harvested material that Allegheny Wood Products did produce. Well, now with that company gone and the land being donated to West Virginia, who's going to manage the land? If West Virginia is just going to, quote unquote, turn it in protected land and there will be no more harvesting from it, that begs, that gives me a little bit of alarm. Certainly the eastern forests are not quite the same as the western forests, but we have determined that wildfires happen. We've seen wildfires all across Pennsylvania, upstate New York, certainly into the Carolinas. It happens in eastern forests. It's a maybe different mechanism. Well, it's not a different mechanism. It's a different reason than we see in some of the western forests, but overpopulation and unmanaged forests is something we have to be seriously concerned about. So, anybody in the state of West Virginia who's listening to this, I would love to know how you plan to manage that protected land. Is it going to be completely off limits to logging? Because there has been a long history of concession logging. That's privately owned land that's been logged successfully and sustainably for many, many decades by Allegheny Wood Products. Took wood out of it. What's going to continue? Will the state manage that and allow for forest concessions? I would love to know. And I'm hopeful that considering the amount of revenue the state of West Virginia generates from the lumber industry, that some plan is in place. And maybe I'm being alarmist here, and maybe someone has some more news on this. Believe me, I have sent some emails to Department of Forestry in West Virginia to find out if anybody has any plans on this. But if anybody's listening and knows and wants to kind of point me to someone or give me a shortcut, I would love to know. I think this could be a great opportunity for the state of West Virginia to bring some land under the purview of state management and do it right instead of just turning it into a place that's pretty and we can go hiking in. And, I love to go hiking. I love to go mountain biking as much as the next guy, but not at the cost of that forest not being managed properly and causing possible wildfire hazards to the state of West Virginia and all of its neighboring states. So really curious to find out what's going on there. Next in the news, this one was particularly interesting to me. There have been reports of the Nanyang Technical University in Singapore. I can't remember what building it is now. I think it's one of their business college buildings. It is Asia's largest mass timber structure. It's a 125 or $421 million project that has been celebrated really the world over. I've seen this design a couple places as the pinnacle of sustainable architecture. And certainly from a mass timber perspective, a lot of people have been paying attention to this. Well, shortly after the building opens its doors to students, mold started cropping up everywhere on the vents, on the timber structures themselves. And immediately people started saying, oh, it's the mass timber. It's the Austrian spruce that is attracting the mold, that is growing the mold. And this was a major, major black mark on mass timber. I reached out to several of the experts I know in CLT manufacturers, GLT manufacturers, and they were all like, we can't imagine this would be the case because part of the manufacture of these timbers does involve pesticides. And it's actually, I don't know if pesticide is quite the word here, moldicide, fungicide. Basically, a lot of paint products, if they're used in interiors and exteriors, will have some sort of fungicide to prevent the growth of mold. It's very common in the coatings industry, and the mass timber industry has embraced this as well. Well, it turns out a little bit more investigation. Some experts went in and looked at the NTU building, Nanyang Technical University, and it has been officially determined that no, it was not the spruce that was causing the mold. It was just the climate, a lot of wet temperatures and improper climate control management that just provided the environment for mold to grow, and that it would have grown on any surface, irrespective of whether it was a mass timber building or gypsum board. So I was glad to hear this, because like I said, all the research I'd done, everybody was like, this can't be. It can't be the timbers. Who made these timbers? Did somebody, and there was immediate investigation in who actually made the timbers. Did they cut corners? Because without those fungicides, yes, it could be possible for a timber building, being a hydrophilic and a sugar-filled species that could actually grow mold. That could be a real problem, which is why mass timber, pretty much par for the course, has these chemical additives to prevent the growth of fungus and mold, etc. So this is still one of those stories that's in the news, and certainly a couple of experts that said, no, it's absolutely not the timber, but I don't think there's really been a fully definitive answer yet. But it was nice to see a lot of people immediately stepping up and saying, this can't be the timber, because who manufactured it? If they did it wrong. So that leads me to another story. Oh, how shall I put this? No, I'll just put it bluntly. I have been terrified to talk about this. I got 8, 9 emails within 15 minutes of a blog post being published. And many of you watching this have probably already read this blog post. I actually got an email about 10 minutes before I started recording today from someone who said that there has been an article by a noted blogger. I found it funny. He didn't identify the blogger, but then he actually linked to the article about mahogany. Now, some of you are already going, oh, I know what he's talking about. Those of you who don't know what he's talking about, the article is written by Christopher Schwarz. And in his Substack, he wrote an article about how mahogany, we should use mahogany that's already in circulation, mahogany that's already been made into furniture, because there's a lot of furniture that's in antique stores that's showing up on the curb that could be taken and milled into perfectly usable mahogany, but we should not buy new mahogany. And I'm not going to go into the whole thing. It's a very well-written article, as to be expected from Christopher Schwarz, the consummate journalist that he is. How do I put this bluntly? I love Chris. I love everything he's done for the woodworking industry. I love his writing. I own most of his books, but I do find that as a journalist, a good journalist, sometimes he writes things that sensationalist is not right, but he'll say things that specifically will provoke debate. He says, mahogany is probably the nicest wood that I've ever worked with. It is a perfect furniture timber. In general, it is strong, easy to work, easy to finish, and looks spectacular. It's such a wonderful furniture that humans have abused it, almost to extinction. You can fight about this statement in the comments if you want, but you won't find me there. That is so Schwarz. You'll throw out that comment and then it politely excuse himself from the conversation. I think that's what makes a good journalist, frankly. It is clear that in the New World, about 80% of the supply of this wood is cut illegally. I will not buy new boards of it, period. There's quite a bit more in the article that goes on to talk about a point that I agree with. There is a lot of mahogany that was made into furniture, and that furniture is basically trash for whatever reason or another. These are good boards. Why not use them? In fact, some of it is going to be really nice old growth stuff that's probably been in furniture form for hundreds of years. That's going to be really good stuff. However, I've gotten a lot of emails, a couple voicemails from people who buy mahogany, who are alarmed by this statement, because obviously Christopher Schwarz is a trusted member of the woodworking community. Guy knows his stuff. As a journalist, he doesn't just make statements without any kind of fact, but at the same time, since he's launched his own blog, he's admittedly said, hey, I don't have to fact check anymore because I'm not working for a newspaper. I work for myself. I've gotten some phone calls from people in the lutherie industry who still use a significant amount of mahogany, who were questioning, is this true? Because I buy mahogany and it was always my understanding that it was sustainably sourced. So from the lumber industry perspective, and please folks, Don't get me wrong. I'm not fighting with Chris. I agree with what Chris has said. You can fight about it if you want, but I won't be part of this. But I do feel like I need to chime in with a bit of on the ground industry experience. I've been hesitant to talk about this because the minute we start talking about the environmental nature of specifically rainforest woods, it's like talking about religion or politics. You just can't convince people. Obviously, I work for the lumber industry, so I'm going to have an opinion and people are going to immediately dismiss it because I make my money on the selling of mahogany. Fact of the matter is, that's not really that true. Since genuine mahogany was Appendix 2, CITES listed 2008, we don't sell a lot of genuine mahogany anymore. And I'm speaking for just my company. The people that I sell to that bought genuine mahogany, most of them have been moved over to some sort of mahogany variant from Africa, usually sapele, sometimes Udele. There are still buyers of genuine mahogany. I still do stock a small amount of genuine mahogany for those specific buyers. And even those buyers are in a sunsetting program to move to some sort of African variant because the restrictions on mahogany are such that it makes it difficult to get, but also there is no question that mahogany was abused to the point where it became CITES listed. It is not an endangered species. It is not on the verge of extinction. It is an Appendix 2 species, which by definition means it is in danger of becoming endangered if we don't do something about it. Well, guess what? In 2008, CITES voted and did something about it. They specifically applied a global quota to CITES, and it was a significant reduction of the total number of containers that can be shipped of genuine mahogany, Sweetina macrophylla, and that's from any country. So whether you're talking about Mexican mahogany or you're talking about Brazilian mahogany or Bolivian or Paraguayan, or Honduran mahogany, which mahogany hasn't come out of Honduras in quite some time, there is a global limit, a global quota that is enforced through, not enforced, but it is regulated by CITES and enforced by all the local governments and here in the United States by the U.S. Department of Fish and Wildlife, specifically the U.S. Lacey Act. Since CITES has gone into effect, mahogany has rebounded quite well to the point where in my 15-year tenure in this industry, I have seen the quality of mahogany change for the better. When I first joined the industry, mahogany was definitely not looking too good. It had really wide growth rings. The color was crazy. Depending on where you bought it, north or south in its range, it was a totally different species. It was rowy and kind of difficult to work with. It reminded me a lot of kaya or African mahogany. It was not good. Mahogany coming into the country now is a very different wood. It's not the mahogany of the golden age. It's not the stuff that you'll find being dredged from the bottom of rivers. It's not the stuff that Thomas Chippendale worked with or Goddard and Townsend worked with. No, it's not. But it's a heck of a lot better than it was 10 years ago because of the global quota. In fact, I think it's one of those things where I can say that CITES and locally US Lacey has actually worked. It has provided structure and regulation for a species to allow it to recover. Now, will genuine mahogany be taken off of Appendix 2? I doubt it. I can't think of an instance where a species has gone into Appendix 2 and then graduated away from it. Not on the flora side of things. We have seen it on the fauna side of things. Let's just say if genuine mahogany does come back, the market has moved on. Most of the large manufacturers that were using mahogany are now using sapele, and they probably will not go back. The shift was difficult enough, and now they've discovered that sapele actually in many instances is a better wood, Udele even more so to some manufacturers. Will genuine mahogany ever be in demand again? It's hard to say, but I don't really see the regulation falling off, certainly not in my lifetime. So what does this regulation mean? It means that it is nigh on impossible to import genuine mahogany into the United States without a CITES permit. Once it's in the country, however, it doesn't require a CITES permit. I can move mahogany from North Carolina to Alaska and not require a CITES permit. I cannot move genuine mahogany from Florida to Canada or North Dakota to Canada without a CITES permit. That CITES permit has traceability. And in many instances, let's face it, the large portion of the mahogany that's on the market today is coming from Brazil. Brazil's forestry department, IBAMA, uses a blockchain-based technology and tracking system to monitor everything back to the stump. I have a great deal of faith in the paperwork, the system, the architecture that monitors timber traffic coming out of Brazil. The same thing has been applied in many of the other range states for genuine mahogany. My company and my buyers have personally visited concessions in Guatemala, in Mexico, in Honduras, in Fiji, in Brazil, Peru, Uruguay, even Bolivia, although we haven't bought from Bolivia in many, many years because Bolivia is not a member of CITES. They thumb their nose at CITES, and essentially Bolivian mahogany is illegal now. But the point is, people in my company, as well as all of my major competitors have also visited these countries. They've visited these concessions. They've looked at their concession plans. They've looked at the mandatory 40-year concession plans in order to be able to cut down a tree in any of these range states. They've looked at the silvicultural plans and how that genuine mahogany is managed. And there is a clear line of sight from a board to a stump to a concession plan that shows where that tree came from, including some instances, a GPS tag, and lesser instances, a hammer brand with an RFID tag that can track that pack of lumber to that stump, which can then be mapped to a concession. And you can see where that tree was, when it was felled, and when the next tree in that hectare quadrangle is going to be felled in accordance with the silvicultural management plan that was approved by the regulating body, IBAMA, in most instances. That line of sight is intense to the point where there are drones flying across these concession plans that have those, flying across those concessions that have those concession plans in their databanks, or at least being referenced back by a human monitoring that drone footage. These rainforest canopies, and mahogany being a canopy tree, is such that when a single mahogany tree is felled, a hole opens in the canopy that is visible from the sky, and the drones pick it up. When one of my buyers was actually in Brazil, out in the concession, and we're talking like a 3-day drive into the bush, they got a phone call from IBAMA saying, "We just spotted a hole in the canopy, go investigate this." And an illegal wood miser was found and shut down. Unfortunately, they did fell a tree, but they got a single tree before they were shut down that exact same day. What happened to that tree? That tree is actually part of a story that I talked about a couple episodes ago, where seized lumber is now being made into apiaries to further the growth of honeybees. It is a shame that that one tree went down. It is a shame that illegally it was taken down, but they were caught. More importantly, I called that concession owner in the last week, and I had them look at that grid square again. That hole in the canopy, it's gone. This happened, two-ish years ago, maybe closer to 3 years ago. That hole in the canopy is now gone. It has been replaced by a tree that qualified as a feeder tree, because the concession silvicultural management plan being used is shelter tree, meaning there has to be at least 3 feeder trees around that tree before it can be cut. Well, this tree was cut illegally. It wasn't determined to be cut, but it was mature enough that a poacher thought, "I'm going to take this." Well, guess what? The silvicultural management plan had that tree planned to be taken down sometime in the next year. So those feeder trees were already in place, already growing up, and they filled that hole in the canopy, and essentially homeostasis in that tiny little microcosm of that canopy was returned relatively quickly. In fact, the long-term studies coming out of IBAMA now show that as these legally harvested trees are taken down and those holes in the canopy are opened, the reclamation of the forest is way faster than anyone thought. Now, I don't have that article in front of me. There were some actual numbers thrown out. I'll see if I can dig it up and post it in the show notes. But the long story short is, when managed properly and harvested according to silvicultural plan, the holes in the canopy disappear within months. The trees take over and everything goes back to normal. And those feeder trees do what they do. And they fill that in. They shoot back up and they fill in that hole in the canopy. In other words, this is healthy and sustainable harvesting that is being actively managed by 21st century technology. Does this mean that wood is not being taken down, that people are not being caught? Is this just one isolated incident where someone was caught the same day? Frankly, no. Anecdotally, I've heard of several other instances where this happens, but this also is controlled in other areas. Access to the forest is not that easy. If you're going to bring in a wood miser, a rubber tire of some sort, I'm using wood miser as a brand, some sort of rubber tire bandsaw mill, you've got to have access roads. Those access roads are heavily monitored through the same drone footage, gated control, and individual concession management plans. The people that manage that concession also manage access to those forest roads. It's very difficult to get a bandsaw mill back in there. So what's the alternative? Go out with an axe and cut a tree down and haul it out the old-fashioned way. That's possible, but you can imagine how slow that is and how every one of those gets caught. The other side of the coin is there are actually listening devices on those drones that pick up the sound of an axe hitting a trunk. And there have been instances where people have been caught trying to cut down a tree in mid chopping down of the tree. There is a lot of tech focused on the rainforest at this point, because obviously we need to watch our rainforests. We didn't do a good job 100 years ago, even 50 years ago, we didn't do a good job. But guess what? We're doing a good job now. Now, there are countries that maybe are not doing a good job of it. But here's the thing. I'll just pick on Bolivia. They didn't get their infrastructure up to snuff. They didn't get their paperwork up to snuff. They were expelled from CITES, and their mahogany was listed as illegal. So any mahogany coming out of Bolivia is immediately seized at the border, and it never makes it on the water to even make it to North America. This doesn't mean that there's not some guy with a raft or somebody, Han Solo sticking it in the floor and smuggling it, past the Empire. That's going to happen. So let's talk close to home. If you want to buy genuine mahogany, let's go with Schwartz. Chris, good point. There is a lot of furniture out there made out of mahogany that should just be taken apart and turned into something else. Do that. Go to antique stores. Look at the curb. Go to your local dump. You'd be surprised what you might find. But we don't all have access to that. Does that mean we immediately should boycott our lumberyards who carry genuine mahogany? Hell no. When you ban a lumber species, that lumber species immediately loses value. And the folks in the forest who are making money by harvesting that tree suddenly have no way to make money. So they find other ways to make money, and they sell that land to cattle ranchers. The number one cause of deforestation is not the lumber industry, folks. It's cattle. It's clear cutting of land in order to make room for livestock. They're also contributing a fair bit of methane to the atmosphere. But that has to happen, right? We need livestock. We need food. We need animal husbandry to happen. But when you devalue a species, it'd be nice for us to all say, oh, we're lovely and noble. We want to go hiking in that forest. But here's the thing. In a lot of these countries, that's not a possibility. A large portion of the revenue in a lot of these countries comes from timber. So let's support that industry and make sure that they're going to continue good silvicultural practices. They're going to continue to manage this chain of custody. These certifications like FSC and TLTV and SSI or SFI, let's make sure that these are in place and backed and understood so that we have line of sight into the harvesting that's happened. But once it gets to this country, if you go to a lumberyard and they sell genuine mahogany, you need to ask that lumber dealer, from whom did you buy your genuine mahogany? Or more importantly, I guess you could say, did you import this genuine mahogany directly? Are you the importer of record? The answer is yes. Do you have a CITES passport for this? Do you have a CITES permit? I should say, not a CITES passport, a CITES permit. Do you have an import permit, a CITES import permit on this? If they are the importer of record, they will have one. If they do not, frankly, call the Department of Fish and Wildlife because it's illegal and shut their asses down. these could be my colleagues. They could be my competitors. And honestly, I can tell you with great confidence, the company I work for does it right. The companies that we do business with do it right. How do I know? Because we inspect each other's paperwork, because we have to. According to the U.S. Lacey Act, we have to. We have to perform our due diligence on anyone that we buy lumber from. If it is a CITES controlled material, we have to have that CITES permit. If we're in the chain of custody, we have to have a copy of that permit. If it's not a CITES controlled species, we have to adhere to local laws. So if we brought that lumber in from Suriname, we have to make sure that it was harvested in accordance with Suriname's local laws in order to be in compliance with the U.S. Lacey Act. And we have to maintain paperwork that says that. So if you're talking to an importer of record, they will have all the paperwork to show that this is above board, this was harvested sustainably, this was harvested legally and brought into the country legally, and the paperwork will be there to back it up. But if you buy lumber from somebody who bought it from somebody else, here's what I'm going to tell you. Did you buy it from the importer of record? If no, don't buy it from them. If they're third, fourth, fifth party, don't buy it from them. There are enough lumber companies out there who are buying directly from an importer of record. These are my customers. These are my competitors' customers. There's enough of them out there that you can find someone else. And frankly, if there's that many, stops in the supply chain, if you're buying from a lumber retailer that bought it from somebody who bought it from somebody who bought it from somebody who bought it from somebody, each one of those somebodies took a markup. More than likely, that lumber is substantially more expensive than the stuff you're buying from elsewhere. Which brings to the next point. If you've bought genuine mahogany, you generally have an idea of how much it's going to cost. If you find it dramatically cheaper and everything is the same, it's kiln dried, it's the same grade, it's the same width spec and length spec, and it's dramatically cheaper, why is that? And this may sound stupid, like you go to the guy who's giving you this killer deal and you go, why is this so cheap? And you're thinking, you idiot, he's going to raise the price. That's a valid question. How is this genuine mahogany $1, $2, $3 cheaper per board foot than anywhere else I'm getting it? How did you manage that? And the answer could be, well, I bought it from a broker and we bought it, a whole container of it. Oh, okay. Was that broker the importer of record? They weren't. Don't buy it from them. If you're buying a controlled species, specifically a CITES species, hell, if it's not a CITES species, if you're buying an exotic material that you're concerned about its provenance, don't buy it. Third, what is that? It'd be third party. I don't know if that's quite right. Buy it from the importer of record if at all possible. And if not, buy it from their direct customer. Don't buy it from their customer's customer. That third link in the supply chain, don't do it. That's just an easy rule of thumb to embrace. But by wholesale boycotting new on the shelf genuine mahogany, you don't support an industry that needs support. That lumber needs to have value. If everyone stops buying it, the price will plummet. And a lot of people go, oh, great, no one's going to cut it down anymore because they can't make any money on it. That's absolutely true. They can't make any money on it, so they will find a way to make money off of that forest. That doesn't end well for a species. So there will always be holes. There will always be some guy who's found a way to bring illegal lumber into the country. But as a consumer of genuine mahogany, just ask 2 questions. Are you the importer of record? Yes, I'd like to see your CITES permit. If they're not the importer of record, did you buy it from the importer of record? Now, the guy out on the stacks may not know, but someone in that building knows. And don't buy it until you get an answer. Who was your importer of record? You find out who that importer of record is? You can call them if you want. Or you can get the bill of lading, you can get the invoice that they bought it from, and you can trace it back to the importer of record, and they will give you a copy of the CITES permit, or at least give you the information that you need to know that it was imported legally. The paperwork is there. The system is there. It's not perfect, but there are ways that we as consumers and users of this material can continue to support this industry without, rolling the dice and going, I don't know if it's legal or not. Don't buy mahogany from a dude out of the back of his truck in, the Walmart parking lot. Same reason you wouldn't buy anything that way. Don't buy genuine mahogany on Craigslist. Or if it's a great deal, do you have a CITES permit for that? And the guy says, no, walk away. Don't support that illegal stuff, because there's enough people in this industry who are doing it right, who have the paperwork, who are supporting these industries, trying to keep this species alive and trying to allow this species to recover. And there's a significant amount of money being sunk into the infrastructure in these regional areas. There's a huge amount of infrastructure in place to provide education to the locals in the forest, to give them an income, to give them a business, to allow them to run a sawmill in their village that feeds the entire village. These are very good things that are happening in our rainforests that involve the cutting down of trees. And that's going to immediately, raise the hackles on a lot of people's neck. You're cutting down trees in the rainforest. There's nothing good about that. Well, I'm sorry. That's wrong. And yes, I work for the lumber industry. Yes, I am understandably biased, but you know what? I'm also a woodworker who happens to love working with genuine mahogany. I have a fair bit of genuine mahogany in my own collection. I love working with the wood. I want to continue to see that wood available for generations to come. And this is how we do it. We continue to support that industry. We don't automatically wholesale boycott the industry. And there are manufacturers out there, specifically in the guitar industry, who still use a lot of genuine mahogany. And believe me, they're under the magnifying glass by U.S. Lacey. Fish and Wildlife monitors everything they do. Some of them have gotten raided. A couple of them have gotten busted. And they fixed it. They've changed their compliance programs, and they've been audited since and have passed with flying colors. The system actually does work. And believe me, if you haven't figured it out already, I'm kind of a libertarian in a lot of my political views. I tend to be like, fix my roads and leave everything else alone. But this is one of these instances where the system is an international system. It's not just the US government. It's a variety of federal governments and international governing bodies like CITES that have allowed this infrastructure to be in place so that you can buy genuine mahogany knowing where it came from. And if you really want to dig, you can probably find the stump from which it was cut. You might even be able to get the grid scare and look it up on Google Earth and see that there's no hole in the canopy. The information is out there. So Christopher Schwartz is absolutely right. Use the stuff that's already on the curb, that's already been built into furniture. There's nothing wrong with that coffee table, planing it down and building another piece of furniture. I've done this myself. I have 2 Adirondack chairs in front of my house that came from redwood. I have a side table in my guest bedroom that's made from mahogany that was reclaimed from my wife's great grandmother. I think I got that right. We got the frankly awful Victorian piece of furniture. I took it apart, milled it down, and made it into a shaker coffee table. I know, shaker made out of mahogany. It's kind of funny. This is a great, great thing that Chris is saying. But his somewhat sensational statement that this large percentage of the new mahogany is illegal, I call BS on that, Chris. And that's not me saying, hey, put your jukes up and let's fight. Let's turn this into a whole big thing. I completely agree with Chris. But I think to be a buyer of lumber these days, you must be an informed buyer. If you choose to look the other way, I want to say that's on you, but it's not. That's on everybody, because you're affecting everybody. When illegal lumber is bought and traded in this country, all it does is give the rest of us a bad name, and it shuts companies down who are doing it right. That was very preachy. I know that was very preachy. So let's move on and let's talk about burls.
You've probably seen a burl in some shape or form. For those watching the video, I've got an image of a maple burl up on the screen. It's just a chaos of wood grain. You may have even seen burls on trees. They're these big kind of swollen, balls, spherical growths on the tree itself. And this is another type of figured wood, but it's a little bit different from how figured normally presents in a tree due to some growing conditions. And this whole topic kind of spins out of several of you have had questions, but one of note, Tim wrote in and said, I started making my own picture frames for my photo hobby, and that led to tree removal and sawmilling, and I recently purchased a course from your hand tool school and was very impressed. Well, that's very nice of you to say. But my question is about wood burls. I've been curious about them and have gone so far as to harvest them, harvest a red oak burl 58 inches in diameter for tabletops. Recently, I was hiking the Appalachian Trail, and there were several stands of white oak riddled with burls. So, what are burls? Are they genetic in origin or environmentally introduced, or both? And what might they be used for other than tables, bowls, and pipes? How should you go about working them given the variability in the grain? And I kind of highlight that question from Tim because it kind of hits on everything that I really wanted to talk about today. What are they? Where are they coming from? Possibly are there species that are prone to them? What can we use them for? And how do we work with them? So a burl, technically, let's see. I've got another image of a really, really big redwood burl that basically just looks like a big butt on a tree. A burl, the technical definition is a burl is a result of hyperplasia, a greatly abnormal proliferation of xylem production by the vascular cambium. So let's translate that. It's some sort of infection, possibly, likely, by bacteria or viruses. Yeah, trees get viruses. Could be fungi, possibly insects. It causes the tree to respond with just a massive proliferation of growth. New buds, new wood material, new just cellulose, hemicellulose, new growth. What's interesting is the growth has really no confines. It has no existing structure of which to conform to. It just kind of goes crazy. And at its heart is compartmentalization. When a tree has a wound or an infection, it can wall that off or compartmentalize it and deal with it. So if you've ever, taken a piece of bark off the tree, a couple episodes ago, I talked about how Native Americans are harvesting Western red cedar bark and just pulling off one long strip. And if they just pull off one long strip, the tree can essentially scab over. They can compartmentalize off that segment of the tree and prevent it kind of throwing up a firewall and preventing any bacteria, any invasive whatever to get into the rest of the tree until the tree can grow the bark back over. And it can either remove that compartmentalization and reincorporate the tree, or that section that's been compartmentalized could essentially die and fall off, or just die and be a scab forever. And that scab section really makes me think of calluses. And I've had several people in my research who've referred to burls as a callus. There is something, there is an abrasion, there is an infection, there is some sort of external factor that's causing the tree to essentially callus over. And when you think of like how calluses form on our hands or our feet or something like that, they are actual substantial growth. And if you work with your hands a lot, you may have really, really coarse calloused hands and large calluses on them. This is really callus tissue. The burl is made up of the tree's bud tissue, and it hasn't sprouted into foliage or grown into a twig. The burl has a barked, woody surface like the rest of the tree, but it's this weird, spherical shape. As the burl grows, it incorporates a tree's undeveloped buds around that section that surround that burl, and it kind of folds them into its ever expanding form, which is why you can see just massive burls. And Tim said I think it was a 53-inch burl that he harvested. There is a furniture maker up in Lede, Pennsylvania that still, I believe, is selling slices of an 84-inch cherry burl. They are not cheap, which is why I don't have one. But yeah, these burls can get enormous. And I know I did some research. There were some record burls. I think the redwood has the largest record. I can't remember the size of it, but it was stupid large. And that's kind of different from compartmentalization, that the tree is not walling it off, but rather the burl can actually consume the buds around the tree and allow it to continue to grow. But because these cells can grow faster than regular tree cells, because they're not constrained in the structure of whatever that species of tree is, they grow at all seasons. They expand kind of at their own rate in a very unpredictable size and direction and appearance. In human terms, it can be compared to
like a fast-growing yet benign tumor. It's doing its own thing, but it's not really hurting anything. So although these burls grow into weird shapes and sizes on trees that otherwise look normal, the tree looks normal, a burl itself, it's not diseased or contagious. So it's not like that burl is going to eventually kill the tree. It's going to win and kill the tree, or for that matter, it's going to infect other trees nearby in the stand. So this callus tissue that grows as part of a burl has really several purposes. It's all related to tree growth and tree preservation. And because the tree's burl stores the same genetic material as the tree, as the whatever that species of tree is, it's a way actually for the tree to clone itself. And there's been many instances when a fallen tree with a burl on it is actually resprouting from the burl as the log lays on the ground, not like attached to a root system. So that makes me think of like stem cells in humans. Like this is like the basic building blocks of tree, and it's all contained within this burl, and it's just this mass kind of primordial ooze that a tree can respawn from and clone itself from that same genetic material. It's very interesting. Fallen redwoods we see a lot of times will sprout from their burls. That one I think is the most common species in my research. Burls, well, they can be harvested, certainly, but it is a massive wound on the tree. You know, depending upon the size of the burl, you could be cutting off just this huge wound that could be very difficult for the tree to compartmentalize and scab over, and it could cause massive infection. But the other thing is, burls don't have the same chemicals as the rest of the tree, normal branch wood or trunk wood or whatever. So a tree, when the burls are moved, a tree can't really close over a cut-off burl the way that like a branch would scab over when it's pruned off. You'd be left with this burl-sized wound that's wide open to pests, bugs, fungi, all kinds of bacterial infections for many, many, many seasons. Now, it's possible the tree may eventually, grow bark over it, but at that point, the tree's going to be so heavily stressed that it might already have lost the battle. So when it comes to harvesting burls, don't do it. Unless you are felling the tree, if you take a burl off, it's probably going to kill the tree. I suppose if you took a burl off a branch rather than off the main trunk, you have a better chance. It would be a smaller burl, but the tree itself could compartmentalize off that branch and prevent the main part, the main trunk where the nutrients are flowing up through. Still, it's not one of those things you want to go out in the forest and start slicing burls off of trees. And that today is one of the largest sources of actually redwood poaching in the United States, is people going out and cutting these huge burls off of redwoods. Because burls are wound response tissue in some respects, whether it's bacterial or viral wound or an actual physical external wound, they grow where and how they need in order to protect a tree. As they grow, their unsprouted bud tissue, it's folded, it's rolled, it's compressed, and it creates this really unique growth pattern. A lot of overlapping layers from a wood grain perspective, a lot of chatoyancy when you put finish on it and things. You may even find a lot of mineral deposits that have come up through the nutrients. Flooded soil or air pockets can be present. You can even sometimes see air pockets where bark is formed, almost trying to protect from within. It's just chaos inside the tree. Probably when I think of burls, the most common species that immediately pops to mind is Ambonia burl, which is actually Nara. In its figured burl form, we call it Ambonia because it comes from the island of Ambon, which is it part of Indonesia? I don't know if it's actually part of Indonesia now that I think about it. It's in the same archipelago, if you will. Buckeye burl is another one. I've turned that quite a bit. Big leaf maple. Maple in general grows a lot of burls. Here, for those watching the video, I can show some. There's a maple burl that's pretty common. I've got a buckeye burl. Buckeye is interesting because it's a very low density tree. And for whatever reason, I guess it's just prone to bacterial infection. The first thing I can say about burls is it's not truly understood how burls form. So, it's hard to point to a species and say, oh, well, this is why they get a lot of burls. Walnut burl, fair bit. I've actually built a couple of pieces out of walnut burl veneer specifically. Redwood, I think, is incredibly common. Redwood burls are just chaos. Almost looks like burn tissue or something. It's just crazy, crazy stuff. But redwoods, again, do get a lot of burls, and that's one of those big poaching things. Oak, willow, box elder, madrone. Those are one of the ones that I think of the most. And if you go to like veneer supply houses and just like search for burl, those are probably the species you're going to see more than anything else. But again, because we're not really totally sure what causes them, no one has been able to artificially create them. And if we understood it, people would go out and start doing things to trees in order to create burls. And remember when I talked about Tamo ash and how some foresters have wrapped rope around the ash tree in order to create that Tamo figure? Basically, people have figured out ways to create various and sundry figures, and they will try to do it as much as possible because obviously you can net more for that material. No one really understands the burl. So when burls happen, they happen naturally. There's no artificial burls, which is what makes them all the more rare, all the more valuable when you find them, which from a how do we use them perspective, I think the number one use is for veneer. Certainly solid wood, I've seen it done. I've seen people make coffee tables out of a whole burl slice. I myself have turned quite a bit of burl wood. I've made a lot of pens out of buckeye burl, a lot of pens out of a cherry burl. And that's also pretty typical when you think about the typical pin blank size, about 3/4 square by maybe 6 inches long. You can get a whole lot of product out of a small burl. I've turned larger vessel sized blanks, bowls, vases out of maple, big leaf maple burl. I built a small jewelry box out of Ambonia burl. And I actually have a block of Ambonia burl that I have been milking for probably 15 years, slowly cutting slices off here and there to make boxes. I have a tri-square hanging on my wall that has a little diamond inlay that is Ambonia burl. And that's really where it gets used because frankly, from a design perspective, there's so much going on that a little goes a very, very long way. At the same time though, veneer really spreads out that rare item. I have built a mirror out of walnut burl. I recently built my mother's urn out of a Zelkova burl, similar like an elm burl. Elm, did I mention elm? I do find a fair bit of elm burls as well. I didn't actually mention that on my list. But I think in order to preserve and stretch that rare material as far as possible, veneer really is the best way to handle it. At the same time, it's also the easiest way to work with it. Working with burl, I compare it to working with really, really knotty wood. A knot is essentially ingrain, and then all the transition, if you imagine a tree as it grows up and into a branch and that wood kind of sprouts outward from the trunk, you're dealing with all kinds of switchbacking grain and a lot of really tough ingrain. Well, a burl, that's like times 20. You've got ingrain, you've got grain switchbacking all over the place. But in some ways, I actually find that makes it a little bit easier to work. There is no grain direction in a burl. So your solution is a really, really, really sharp blade. Probably moisten the surface with something like mineral spirits. And if you're hand planing, always be attacking in a skewed aspect. Now, you talk about skewing, with the grain. Well, there is no grain direction. You're literally pushing your plane at like a 70-degree angle. You're not pushing it straight forward. It's always, always skewed to kind of lower that angle of attack. Possibly a low angle blade might help. I don't even know, in my experience with it, going to a high angle blade really hasn't done that much. Going to a higher angle blade will cause the chip to break faster, but we're not really creating a chip. And that's one thing you'll see as you're planing a burl. You're not going to get shavings. You're going to get kind of large dust, tiny little chips, or think of like a powered planer, tiny, tiny little shavings. That's that is too big. You're really getting more, clumpy dust more than anything else, because there is no grain direction long enough to actually pull up a shaving. Now, a super, 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 super sharp blade, and again, like a mineral spirit moistened wood, can allow you to get a shaving, but you'll find that shaving will crumble apart if you look at it crooked, because there's no, long grain tissue holding the whole thing together. Certainly working with power tools, can work just fine. When it comes to actually smoothing it, grab your sandpaper. It's one of those things where there is no grain direction, so you can't really rely upon some structure in holding things together. So like, I wouldn't want to take a burl and cut dovetails into it, because no matter what, you're going to end up with short grain along those tails, and it's probably going to snap off. And really, do we want to be wasting our burl figure on joinery when you can slice that burl into veneer and put it over top of a more structurally sound, long grain fibered wood? So I just find that when you're using veneer, you don't really have to do anything to the veneer. You glue it in place, and then you do a little bit of light sanding, maybe some pore filling if it's, a particularly gnarly burl, and you're done. You're not shaping it, you're not cutting it, you're not having to deal with all that crazy grain. So if you're in a situation where you've ended up with a raw burl, I would do everything I can to slice that into veneer and use it for veneer. Or, depending on the size of it, you may find that turning it is the best solution. And turning, while most of the time turning, we're going across the grain, turning kind of, you can flip things around, you can turn in grain, you can turn face grain, and really you're kind of working with the grain in all different directions. And again, we rely upon really, really sharp tools, and a lot of times a skewed aspect of a skew chisel to pull it off, which is why most of the solid wood burls that I've worked with have been on the lathe, and very little on using a hand plane, traditional cabinetry, things like that, unless it's been a veneer. So if at all possible, avoid working burl like it's a normal plank of wood. If for no other reason that it's going to tear out a lot, it just won't have the same structure. It's going to be like those cross grain planks that they give kids in karate class that anybody can break. It's just not going to have a lot to it. But what I find particularly cool about the burl is we just don't know. We don't fully understand why a burl forms. But the cool thing is we do know that it's not going to hurt the tree. It is growing kind of adjacent. It's stuck to the tree. It's certainly enfolding some of the other sprouting buds and kind of consuming parts around the tree, but it's growing outward. It's not, I just said consuming, and I was just about to say it's not consuming the tree, but it's growing outward from the tree. And the normal flow of nutrients up and down the trunk of that tree continues unabated. Now, there's an additional mass, and the tree does have to provide additional nutrients for it, but it's not going to hurt the tree unless you cut it off. So don't go into the forest and start slicing these things off. And honestly, if you're looking to use some burl, go to a veneer house, search for burl, and go nuts. But here again, this is a lumber podcast. I'm not going to get a design here, but I've made the mistake of using too much burl in a piece before, and it's just god awful. So use it in moderation because it's rare, but also just, too busy to use too much. So if anybody has, specific experience working with burls, has any tips for working with burls, or has a favorite burl, or has some additional information on how burls form, well, first of all, probably write a scientific paper, because there's no consensus on how they form yet. And if you have the theory, or if you have proof of understanding, then you could probably win a Nobel Prize. Maybe. Do they give Nobel? I assume they give Nobel Prizes for botany. They must. I don't honestly know. So yeah, this is a figured wood because as woodworkers, we view it as figure, but I'm covering it now because it's not really figured. A lot of people will look at a burl and say, oh, that's similar to bird's eye maple. Nope, they are different things. There is a similar process as far as consuming the buds, but a burl grows differently and then figure. It's a response to a reaction. I've heard some people call them tree warts. I don't even know if that's really effective. It's the tree fighting something off, and then it kind of goes off on a rampage and does its own thing. So interesting stuff, and certainly adds a whole lot of interest to the woodwork that we run across, and a whole other type of species, because you'll find many species go by one name and in burl form go by an entirely different name and have an entirely different commercial marketplace for them, similar to what we saw with the Japanese ash and Tamil ash. Same species, but with figure, totally different market. Without the figure, totally different market. That's all I got on burls. I'd love to hear your input on them, and let me know. In the meantime, go to lumberupdate.com to get the show notes for this, or to ask a question, or just lumberupdate@gmail.com if you have any questions for a future show. Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching, everybody. And go buy some lumber. Hey, maybe go buy a burl. It's a lot of fun.